My name is Sam, or Beans, or One Plate Wonder, whatever number of nicknames I've acquired over my very short time at Christ First. So, what is this thing that you guys are sacrificing an evening for? This is Evidence for Easter. This was first hosted as kind of like a little hobby project back in my home church in Dorset, and it got a pretty good reception. It's essentially talking about what's the actual evidence? Can we prove that Christianity is a religion to be believed in rationally? So, who am I again? I'm Sam, 25 years old. I have recently graduated from London School of Theology with a BA in theology, and also I'm currently a research student in historical theology. And I am not a cradle Christian. I am what's known, I'm an ex-atheist agnostic. Some days, if I was in a bad mood, I'd be an atheist. If on a good day, I'd be an agnostic. It kind of just went how it went. And I have, ever since I first converted at the age of 19, I've had a love for apologetics. What is that word? It's not a scary word. It essentially comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to give a defense, to give a reason for something that you actually believe in. This is very different to how we today use the word apology, where we're like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. But nobody at least should be going, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, as an approach to their faith. Instead, it is to make a bold declaration that you actually have backed up. You're not just saying that you believe in it just because you believe in it. There are actual reasons for why Christians are the way that they are, why they endure hardship. And it's something which the church needs to really grapple with, because our approach at the moment, at least in the contemporary evangelical church, is a little bit flawed in a sense. It needs a boost. And what I mean is that when we come to, let's say, evangelism, or even just talking with your uncle at Christmas dinner or something, and your uncle's like a very avid atheist, and you say, the Christian faith has really empowered me to live a meaningful and good life, and he's really transformed me. This is the power of our testimony. And that can really resonate at a heart-to-heart level with people. But your atheist uncle may come to you and say, that's all very well and good, Sam, but I also have Muslim friends, I have Hindu friends, Sikh friends, any friends of any other religion, and they say, wow, they've had a really powerful experience that's really changed their life, and they're certainly not the same as they were before since joining this religion. And so, where's the deal breaker, for lack of a better term? You've got all these testimonies floating around. How do you actually connect? How do you say, I think Christianity is true despite other people's testimonies? And that's where the role of evidence comes in, where we can actually engage with a person through testimony and also through evidence, using the whole of the human experience to actually say, Christianity is true for the whole human experience. So this is essentially what we're going to be covering. It is the essential Christian claims when we're looking at the evidence for them. It bolsters our witnessing, and ultimately, God's placed this in our hands as Christians. And it's important that we use it, that we're not like in the parable that Jesus tells, where we are burying our talent, when in fact we should be investing in it. And it's amazing what God has provided for the church, and it's important that we actually use it. So here is the itinerary of what we're going to be covering. So today, again, apologies for the mishap of saying that it was the 4th rather than today. I certainly hope that people don't turn up on Monday. But today is all about, did Jesus exist as a historical person? That's all we're going to be covering. Whether he was Messiah or a maniac or whatever you thought of him, this is what we're going to be covering. Did he exist as a historical person? And then we're going to go on to, can we trust the New Testament? There are a bunch of documents floating around by these people who claim to have met Jesus, and they've created biographies of him. Can we believe what they say about these in these biographies? How do we know that the Bible that we have today in our hands is indeed the Bible, or the letters and the epistles and the biographies which were written by the disciples and apostles? That's a very important question for how we might use evidence for the Christian faith. And then finally, we're actually going to be covering what I believe is very convincing evidence, historically, that we can say that Jesus rising from the dead is the best explanation of the historical data. That's extremely important. So today, again, going to be covering, did Jesus exist? And I'm very indebted to one particular scholar when I first compiled these slides. And his name is Dr. Bart Ehrman. You see, for those of you who do know Bart Ehrman, not many, but he's popular enough in some circles. You may see one of his books on the bookstore. He is no friend of the Christian faith. He is very against pretty much anything that Christ first here would teach from the Bible. But here's the thing. Him, as an atheist agnostic, wrote a book defending the claim that Jesus existed as a historical person. Ehrman doesn't believe Jesus' claims to be Messiah or a prophet, but he is compelled by the historical evidence to believe that he is a real person who existed. So his is an incredibly important book, one that you could perhaps offer to your atheist agnostic friends, ultimately to say, if you want a source that's not quote-unquote biased, by all means, consult Bart. This book won't make you a Christian, but it will dismantle any claims which you might have or any skepticism which you might have towards Jesus not existing. And this is incredibly important because there are some people out there. There aren't, I would say, many people, at least in maybe the popular sphere. But there are some people who say, with enough skepticism of the Christian faith, either they've been burned by it or they've floated around certain circles on the internet which have convinced them that our central figure of the faith did not exist and that he was a fabrication, that he was a myth, that maybe it started out as a story and then eventually people started attributing stories to him later down the line, like Chinese whispers, where it all gets corrupted. So this is why it's important, because you might, in fact, meet someone at your local shop. Like again with your atheist uncle at Christmas. You might meet someone at the local shop, and they're the ones who are kind of floating around the Jesus mythicist movement, which is arising on the internet. And they might be getting into a conversation with you about religion or whatever, and then they say, where's your proof that Jesus even existed, let alone why I should believe? All we have are biased fairy tales about a man in the desert. That's a very polemical, a very hostile way, but quite frankly, if you're out doing evangelism, if you are sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, you will encounter these people. And also, we have this clip, I think we need to clip on it, where you might go on your favorite TV show or whatever, like Real Time with Bill Maher or something if you're American. And Bill Maher, our talk show hosts and entertainers are quite avid atheists, some of them, especially Bill Maher. He directed an entire film dedicated towards saying, does religion make sense? Or is it just silly nonsense? And so you're looking at this movie, maybe you're curious, and then he mentions some very interesting claims that might bug you. If we could clip the slide, it's only for a few seconds.
Does it ever bother you that the story of a man who was born of a virgin, was resurrected. Your bio was something that was going around the Mediterranean for at least 1,000 years. We've got Krishna, who was in India 1,000 years before Christ. Krishna was a carpenter, born of a virgin, baptized in a river.
Are you saying that was written in history? That was written down in history, is what you're saying?
Absolutely. There's the Persian god Mithra, 600 years before Christ, born December 25th, performed miracles, resurrected on the third day, known as the Lamb, the way, the truth, the light, the Savior.
And just that machine gunning of particular facts might make you a little bit weary. It's like, hold on, I was never taught this before. What if my religion is just one branch of a religious pot that was going around the ancient world, where all of these stories are so similar that they must have come from a similar source? And so what if we're just believing in a corrupted story? Indeed, while you're on the internet, perhaps, you might want answers, and then all of a sudden, like on your Facebook algorithm comes a picture like this, where indeed there's more of this kind of stuff from the Jesus mythicists. Krishna, Mithra, Horus, Dionysius, Attis, my goodness, all like born of virgins, December 25th. They all have similar events that happened in like we see in Jesus' biographies. What's going on here? Why wasn't I taught this? I mean, it's on the internet, right? So somebody must have had like some things to back this up with before they decided to boldly post it on the internet. You can see where we're getting at. So indeed, was Jesus made up as a copy of pagan gods? Was my pastor hiding this from me? Is Aaron and Andy secretly hiding this to steal your tithe money or whatever it is? Have I been lied to about my Bible? And should I remain a Christian? Because apparently it's even disputed that there was a historical man called Jesus walking around in Judea, Palestine in the first century. This is why we need apologetics. Your testimony might be very potent and powerful, but saying that you had a powerful experience in church and you received an altar call, you received the Holy Spirit, won't necessarily be good answers or satisfying answers to those who are asking these kinds of questions. And we might get so focused upon these controversies and doubts that we might end up being so fixated on these that we're actually ignoring what, again, the church has been given. We might be veering over into the hazy, dark clouds of doubt when actually what's been put in front of us, especially with the internet, my goodness, how much we have on the internet, commentaries, academic books and journals. You can learn, probably I would say, although you need a good discipline, like the original languages of the Bible from home. You can buy a textbook and learn it yourself. This is the age of information. And indeed, you can listen to millions of lectures and sermons, which might very well touch on the topic which you're currently doubting with. But if you don't know that these things exist, how will you be comforted? I fear that there are many people today who, for various reasons of why they might have left the faith, might have left the faith due to a lack of knowing that what they're struggling with actually has good, solid research behind it. And especially for the Christian, this should be a focus. Because we look at the Apostle Peter, and he says, honor in your hearts, honor Christ, the Lord, as holy. And here's the thing, always being prepared to make a defense. The Greek word there, apologia, being prepared to make an apologia to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And here's the key thing, do it with gentleness and respect. Nobody comes into the kingdom of heaven on their knees after a really bad argument that's been going on for about 4 hours. Maybe there's one person, but that's not what you're going to do to someone on the street or in the shop, or most likely your family. So here's what we're going to be covering tonight. We're going to be covering 3 types of sources, or three areas which talk about what we've shown tonight in terms of the problems. Non-New Testament sources, we're going to be covering them. There are sources outside of the New Testament that talk about Jesus. And we have New Testament sources. We'll get on to why we can use the New Testament later. And then just for the sake of time, because I don't want you guys sleeping on me, we're going to cover one example of these Christ myth stories that were floating around. We're going to compare the account of Mithras using what the actual scholars say compared to what Facebook and YouTube atheists are saying. And as a kind of devil's advocate, throughout this talk, for the sake of fairness and to really start jolting our thinking, we're going to have Mike the Mythicist. He's not a real person. This is an AI-generated image. But whenever I bring up something which is disputed by Jesus mythicists, I'm going to bring him up, and we're going to see what he says. So let's start. Let's sink our teeth in to the historical data, and it's an abundance of data. If you're taking notes, try not to, because it's a lot that we're going to be covering. So what do we have outside of our New Testament? Well, first off, we need to divide it into even more categories. We have pagan Roman sources from about 100 years after Jesus' death in 30 AD. And so we're just going to be covering 3 sources here today, because there are plenty. So first we have Pliny the Younger. He is a Roman governor who, when he was writing this epistle to the emperor, Trajan, in 112 AD, under 100 years after Jesus' death, he's asking Trajan, what do we do with these Christians? They're not worshipping our gods. They're kind of doing their own thing. Should we kill them? And so he makes this testimony of what early Christians believed in 112 AD, at least. And it's about how they meet together on a specific day, early in the morning. They swear not to do any wicked deeds or to commit fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify a word. And they sing a verse, and they sing a hymn to Christ as a God. What does this mean? This is a testimony that at least in 112 AD, there is Pliny not disputing that Jesus was an actual historical figure. We look at Suetonius. He's a biographer and historian. He's writing a book, 12 Lives of Caesar, again, from within the first 100 years of Jesus' death. And he's documenting the history of Roman emperors. And he testifies to Jesus as a real person, because the Jews at Rome caused constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus. He expelled them from Rome. This is what you find in your Bible if you turn to chapter 18 of Acts. Problem, Mike will say, who's this Chrestus guy? I thought you guys were worshipping Christ. The manuscripts that we have of Suetonius say Christus. If he wanted to refer to Jesus, if he believed in this made-up historical figure, then he would have used Christus. So therefore he's not talking about Jesus. There's somebody else called Christus. How do we respond? First, misspellings were frequent and accepted in this period. We'd especially expect it of Suetonius, who himself was not a Christian, was removed from the conversation, but he is documenting that there was a historical man around the time of the instigation, which was around 30 AD, 40 AD, called Jesus Christ. And sometimes, even in our early Bibles, we have Christianos rather than Christianos. That's very important. That's in one of our earliest Bibles, Codex Sinaiticus. You're going to be seeing a lot more of that Bible in the next session. And then we have Tacitus. He is a very hostile source to the Christian faith in his writings. He does not like the Christians. He's writing 115 AD. He, as a historian, again attests to Jesus being an actual person. He's talking about Nero lighting Christians on fire in order to have revenge upon the burning of Rome, which allegedly, apparently, he caused himself, but he needed a scapegoat. And so Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. And Tacitus testifies, he's no friend of the Christian faith, that Jesus is a historical figure. Why is this important? If you're hostile towards the Christian faith, if there was any idea circulating at the time that Jesus was a mere made-up person who didn't even exist, you would use it. It would just make sense. But even those hostile towards the Christian faith, they don't believe in Jesus Christ, but they believe that he existed. We're going to come to the Jewish sources as well, because there are Jewish sources, one from around the time, another for a more evangelistic reason. So first we have Josephus. He is a historian writing in the same century as Jesus walked and did his ministry and died. 64 years after Christ's death, he wrote the Antiquities of the Jews. And he says this, it's amazing what he documents here. This is so encouraging for me in my faith. But the younger Ananus, who, as we told you already, took in the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, the so-called Messiah, Christ, whose name was James, and some others. Josephus is attesting not only to Jesus as a person who claimed to be the Messiah, even his own brother, James. And then, here's something for you to watch out for, if you get really deep into these debates. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and of many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. What's the problem? A religious Jew would not say this. And Mike the Mythicist gets this point very well. The vast majority of scholars and historians show that this passage was added by a very cheeky Christian scribe years after Josephus' death. And so, therefore, Mike the Mythicist will say, how can we trust anything that comes from Josephus? Anything, even if he just mentions Jesus like in the previous passage, what if that's fabricated too? But there's a problem. Bart Ehrman, again, the historian, atheist agnostic, says the majority of scholars of early Judaism and experts on Josephus actually think that this verse had a primitive form. And so here is a redacted, more simplified version of what historians believe is actually what Josephus wrote. It's about that he was a man, that he was condemned to a cross, and that the Christians survive to this day, 94 AD. So Josephus is still a good witness, especially of that previous passage. That is utterly amazing that we even have his brother recorded in history. And the second, this is for those who are dealing with our Jewish friends, the Talmud, which is a commentary on Jewish law. You have I believe it's the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, two different traditions. They're essentially commentaries on the Torah, commentaries upon Jewish law. And there is a case to be made that Jesus was a actual person who existed according to their own rabbis, where they're very hostile to him, as you would. He did mighty miracles via sorcery, hanged on the eve of Passover. He was a teacher and he was a disciple that turned out badly. What's the consequence? That means that if you're talking to a religious Jew, they can't say, if they hold to the authority of the Talmud, that Jesus never existed. And the same thing with Islam as well. Islam reveres Jesus. That's one of the first things that a Muslim will say to you, is we revere Jesus to be a prophet. It's just we don't believe that he died on a cross, and that he didn't claim to be God, and that he was the Messiah just for the Jews, that kind of stuff. So let's go towards our Christian sources now. We've covered pagan sources, Jewish sources. Now let's look at Christians who lived outside of the New Testament around this same time. Because again, if this was if Jesus was just so made up, we have so many early sources from all ideologies that attest to him being an actual person with nothing ever stated to the contrary. We have Papias. He is a strange figure who pops up, who we know is a historical figure. He pops up in this one part of this church historian's book called Eusebius. Eusebius had his documents that Papias wrote, but we don't. So glad that Eusebius got to enjoy that, but we don't. And he is apparently known as the hearer of the Apostle John, and he recorded conversations with early followers of Jesus. This is an extremely early source, and all of these Christian sources are not really going to even report that Jesus did not exist as a man, being used as an objection to the faith. Next, we have Ignatius of Antioch. He lived from around 50, and he died by being fed to the lions after not renouncing his faith in around the 130s, let's say. There's a dispute upon when he exactly died. But he was a student of one of the disciples, the Apostle John. We have 7 letters preserved for us today, which is absolutely incredible. This is such a close source, essentially like one generation away from an eyewitness himself of Jesus actually existing. And then we also have Clement. He was an elder in Rome, and we have one of his letters preserved as an epistle to the Corinthians, a place in Greece. And this was around in the 90s AD. And he even records the martyrdoms of the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul. It's one of the earliest Christian documents that we have outside of the New Testament. And again, Clement obviously would say Jesus existed as a historical person. This, historically speaking, for the ancient world, is utter gold that you don't see in any other sources. So again, let's look at what we have today. Like we have these sources as well. Again, all of these outside the New Testament, and I haven't even mentioned the Didache, another document from around 90 AD. I haven't even mentioned Polycarp, a contemporary of Ignatius, as well killed for his faith, and attesting that Jesus Christ walked and lived and breathed and did ministry among us as an actual person. But you see, Mike will say, all of these sources are decades after Jesus is supposed to have lived. You know, the Romans kept very good records. Why don't we have any records of Jesus' miracles and ministry from the early 1st century? That might put a rock in your shoe in a bit, but let's actually just look at what we're dealing with here. But every source from the first 100 years, unanimous that Jesus existed as a historical person. We've said this many times. And again, even those who are hostile towards the faith. So let's all just take a breather and look at this chart. This is something utterly mind-boggling. These are the most up-to-date figures, by the way, I believe, since 2020. If you see figures which show numbers a little bit less than this, that means that the person that you're reading is using out-of-date sources. That's just a technicality. But what is this chart? This is a chart of famous authors and historical persons throughout history. It shows a famous work that they made. Think of Homer and the Iliad. Think of Plato's works. Caesar's Gallic Wars. If you go in your Latin class, you're going to be very intimately related with this book, the Gallic Wars. Tacitus even in his annals. So let's just look at these figures 1 second. Okay? Homer wrote the Iliad in around 800 BC. The earliest manuscript that we have of Homer, 400 BC. That's a time gap of 400 years. We have around 1,800 manuscripts to compare and make sure that there are no mistakes. That's how historians would compile them. So that's pretty good, but then all of a sudden we really start getting, historically, really bad news. If Mike's standard is to be held as the gold standard for everything else. Would you dispute the existence of Caesar or the fact that he invaded Gaul, when indeed it was written between 58 and 44 BC, but the earliest manuscript that we have of this, 900 AD, gap of around 950 years, 250 manuscripts. Tacitus, Thucydides, all of this, I'm not going to get into all of this, but notice at the bottom over here, the New Testament, compiled and written, I'd say around the 40s to 90s AD, but you could take 50 to 100, why not? The earliest manuscript that we have, about 130, it's in a library in Manchester, P52. You can go see it if you're ever in Manchester one time. That's about a time gap of 50 years. As we get to more fuller copies of the New Testament, we're looking at around maybe 100 years after the fact. Around 5,000, in the mid-5,000s, it's very hard to estimate, but in the mid-5,000s of the manuscripts that we have in Greek alone. So you want to dispute the closeness of our sources, or you want to hold your standard so high for history, you would have to exclude pretty much everything on this list. And it is indeed a complete myth, as Ehrman will say, that the Romans kept detailed records of everything, and that as a result, we are inordinately well informed about Roman Palestine. If the Romans kept such records, where are they? Maybe they burned down in certain library burnings in Alexandria. I don't know. But the case is that we lose a lot of documents to history. So it's in no way surprising. Let's even just take, for example, evidence that Pontius Pilate exists, okay? Pontius Pilate, 30s AD, most important man in Israel at the time. Very intimately acquainted with the Roman system. What sources do we have? Josephus. Oh, well, that's very far away from when Pilate was supposed to have lived, if we're going to go by Mike's standards. Philo, he's closer. We have Tacitus as well. You're going to discount Tacitus with Christ. You can also discount Tacitus with Pilate. With the Pilate stone and several coins. For the most important person that we have in Judea. And historians are not breaking a single sweat over saying that Pilate exists. So think about how the same historians are even more confident that Jesus existed. So how many sources do we have so far? At least by my count, it's 10. And this is just outside the New Testament. So what do we exactly have in our New Testament which might further boost our confidence that Jesus existed as a historical person? Hold on 1 second, Sam. What are you doing? You can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. It's a biased source. What are you doing? No, we need to get rid of the Bible. You can't. It's in the Christian's interest to say that he existed as a historical person, or they are actually testifying to history. You see, even without assuming that the Bible is breathed by the Spirit of God and a special communication of God to us today, historians can still treat the New Testament and the Old as a historical source, a historical record compiled by multiple sources. Humanly speaking, the Bible did not have one author. It had many authors, each of these witnesses to certain parts in history. And the New Testament books date back extremely close to the times of Jesus, and they mention certain events which are so close, it's almost like it's touching the time of Jesus historically. And we have a solid case for considering the New Testament actually reliable. That's on the 17th if you want to join. So we have around 10 independent authors for our New Testament alone. So right off the bat, we've got 10 extra witnesses. None of these contradicting the fact that Jesus existed as a person, nor even encountering, again, people who were hostile to the faith who said that he did not exist. Everybody who was hostile to the faith at least thought that he was an actual person. This is historical gold. So we have Matthew, Mark, Luke also wrote a gospel and a history of the early church. We have the Apostle John. We have the letters of the Apostle Paul, the anonymous work of the Hebrews, James, the Apostle Peter, his epistles, Jude, brother of the Lord, and John of Revelation. And so think about it this way, how close in terms of history. Think about Caesar, think about Plato, think about Homer, how largely distant theirs is from their penning and what the manuscripts are. The manuscripts that we have of the four Gospels come around within the first 100, 200 years in terms of the manuscripts that we have. It's absolute gold, historically speaking. And we have the four Gospels here that you'll find in your Bible. First, I believe the majority of scholars would say that Mark was written first. If we're going by just the skeptical scholarship alone, or at least the non-Christian scholarship alone, I should say, Mark written 70 AD, Luke, Matthew around the 80s, John 90s. And a lot of the time with non-believing scholarship, due to various prophetic things that Jesus says concerning the events of 70 AD, they would date it to after the fall of the temple in 70 AD. But essentially, we have four separate historical sources, even for the biographies of Jesus. Each of these attesting to that he exists. But, hold on. Mike the Nicest has done a New Testament class. They're not independent. They all copied from one source, Mark's Gospel. Matthew and Luke copy Mark word for word in most stories. Therefore, we only have one source with a bunch of copycats. And it's not as simple as that. That might be very powerful if you don't necessarily know of, if you don't necessarily take a New Testament class or really dive in deep into what we can find out about the treasures of the four Gospels. You see, there is a theory, it's disputed, but I believe that it makes a lot of sense that Matthew and Luke share similar stories in Mark. That's true. But there's a problem. If both of them are so dependent upon Mark, why do they share certain stories that Mark does not even touch upon if he is their only source? That doesn't make sense. They're using other sources, not just Mark. That opens the door for considering, wow, there must be other sources which Matthew and Luke are getting their information from. And scholars call this Q. It means Quelle in German. It means source. So, in a sense, even from the three Gospels that we have, which are very closely related together, John is his own thing, we have around 4 sources, at minimum. Why do I say at minimum? Because even the biographies of Jesus themselves testify, as Luke does. Luke is a brilliant historian of the early church. He starts off his biography of Jesus in the 80s by saying, many have undertaken, many. So it's not just him. He witnesses to many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us concerning Jesus, just as they were handed down by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, O most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know with the certainty of the things of which you have been taught. Luke here says, I've done my homework. I've done my research. I have consulted those who from the first were eyewitnesses, or I have consulted people who have consulted the eyewitnesses concerning Jesus' works and ministry. That is incredible. And Mark isn't even our earliest source either. This is also something which we might get bogged down. If you talk to Mike the Mythicist too much about the Gospels, you may think, wow, that's like Jesus died in around 30 AD, apparently, and it's about a 40-year gap until we get Mark. So maybe in this 40-year gap, there are some stories which can float around and get corrupted. Problem with that is we look at the rest of the New Testament, which is healthily dated from before Mark's Gospel was even written. Many of the letters of the Apostle Paul, in fact, all of them, I should say. Peter, Epistle of Jude, Epistle of James, John, the author of Revelation, Epistle of Hebrews, all of these date from around 10 years, I would say, after Jesus died to around 90 AD, with the penning of Revelation, the final book in your Bible. So if we really want to get right down, let's say that the person that you're speaking to, the mythicist, is really, they've read a few books on Jesus' mythicism, and they're really getting deep there. They're giving you an answer for everything that you're putting at them if you're going to give them all of this data. And one of the best things that you can do, I believe, is go to the book of Galatians. Galatians was written around maybe 45 to 55 AD. I'm not sure what the current estimates on the date are now, but it's extremely early. And it details Paul's early ministry from 35 AD onwards. Paul, as readers of the Bible will know, he loves his tangents. And he mentions at the start of Galatians a history of his ministry. And over the course of the early days of him becoming a Christian, only a few years after Jesus died, Paul mentions meeting Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. After 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, in another language that's Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. This is incredibly important, and Ehrman recognizes this for the mythicist case. This is the Achilles heel in many senses. Mythicists have long realized the fact that Paul knew Jesus' brother creates enormous problems for their view, that in fact the otherwise convincing to them case against Jesus' existence is more or less sunk by the fact that Paul was acquainted with his blood relations. I don't know how many of you would probably wish that your sibling was merely a myth and didn't exist, but I'm willing to bet that through the majority of experience, you would testify that if you had a sibling, they would exist. This is an incredible source. And there are various theories for how this might be solved, and this is where you really start seeing the mythicist case really start to really tremble. There may be a missionary group in Jerusalem called the Lord's Brothers. Maybe it's possible, I don't know. But the problem is that the rest of our sources are mythicist speculation. And we even have Josephus testifying that Jesus' brother actually existed. So even if you don't want to take the New Testament, we have Josephus as well, and many other sources which we've showed. So if we're just going to count, that's around 20 people, not eyewitnesses, I should say, historical witnesses to Jesus' existence as a man. You can do what you want with the information so far, whether he's Messiah, Lord, lunatic, liar, but there is a firm foundation that Jesus existed as a historical person. And if you're doing your evangelism, if you're witnessing to your family or to your friends, if they don't believe this data right here is an incredibly important stepping stone. This is what evidence for Easter is. We're doing a stepping stone case towards the resurrection. So the first step that we are to make for the hyperskeptics is, did he exist as a man? So that's 20 sources that we know of. That is utterly insane when you consider this period of ancient history, with all the wars going on, with the paper itself, papyrus reed, it was easily destroyed in water damage. And yet, of the papyri that we do have, they're brilliant preservations which again testify to Jesus' existence. But here's the thing that may have been the rock in your shoe from when I first showed the video. Was Jesus made up? Was the story of Jesus made up from a pool of pagan deities? If you have a person who ignores all of the data so far, and they say, but he's so similar to all of these other stories. My goodness. So similar to all the other stories. How can he not be a myth? He even had this, in fact, I don't know, you could probably look it up online, but even on QI often portrayed as the very intelligent quiz show where often the most common answer that you think of is not the right one. Stephen Fry himself posed the question, which was, who was a person who was born on December 25th, had 12 disciples, and I'm not even joking, died on Vatican Hill? Very puzzling thing. People said, oh, Jesus. And then he buzzed, as you do in the show QI, and he said, no, it is Mithras and all of these other deities floating around at the same time, or roughly the same time that Jesus was walking around, or supposed to. So again, what do we do with these things? Well, let's just take a look at one case study. If we did all of the gods in the world, we'd be here until we all just gather in the dust. So let's just take a look at one case study. Let's look at the cult of Mithras, for example. He was a Persian god, and even sweeping into roughly around the time of Jesus, there started to be a mystery cult that was forming around this Mithras figure. And this is the claim. Born on December 25th. Born of a virgin. 12 disciples, dead for 3 days, resurrected. My goodness. Could it be that the story of Jesus is actually just a story that is copied, that did the Christians copy from the secret cult of Mithras? Born on December 25th, how did the Christians come to it? Did they borrow from Mithras? Did they borrow from all of these other things? Did they even borrow from the winter solstice, as you'll have many people claiming? Well, Andrew McGowan, he wrote a piece in around 2016, but it's been renewed, by the Biblical Archaeology Society. And he said the earliest mention of December 25th, Jesus' birthday, comes from mid-4th century Roman almanac that lists the death dates of various Christians, bishops, and martyrs. The first date listed is December 25th, Christ is born in Bethlehem in Judah. So this is the first early account that we have of Jesus being born, December 25th. Some Christians are like, we just celebrate him on that day, but we don't actually believe that he was born on that day. And maybe there is a case to be made. It was doubted, or like it was still being discussed in the early church. When was Jesus born? When was Jesus born? And one of the ways that the early church would do it is not by consulting a secretive cult, which they were hostile to. Instead, they did something which they borrowed from Jewish tradition. Where did Christianity come from? It came from Judaism. It took traditions from Judaism. Here's one of the Jewish traditions, that a prophet died on the same day that they were conceived. I don't necessarily know why, but this was the methodology that people had for calculating when prophets lived and were born and conceived. So if you date in the western part of the church that Jesus was conceived on March 25th, then December 25th, if you do the maths. But even in the East, none of the Mithras arguments work for the East Christians. Like, if you look at an Eastern Orthodox church, some of them, or most of them perhaps, will celebrate on January 6th. That's not December 25th. And because they have a different date for Easter, they have a different date for Jesus' conception. So this is something incredibly just interesting and important to bring up, is that not all Christians believe in December 25th. If they have another date, maybe it's January 6th. But did Mithras die and rise? That's an incredibly important thing, isn't it? Is Jesus the only person? Or is he among other gods who died and then rose 3 days later, no doubt? Why the number 3? Lee Strobel, in researching for the Case for Christ, interviewed one of the leading figures of Mithras scholarship, university accredited from the Miami University, Edwin Yamauchi. And this is what he said during the interview. We don't know anything about the death of Mithras, contrary to what an anonymous Facebook meme will tell you. We have a lot of monuments, but we have almost no evidence because it was a secret religion. But I know of no reference to a supposed death and resurrection. So we can either take that Facebook meme, or we could take somebody who's dedicated their life to studying the very thing that we're talking about. I'm going to go with Edwin Yamauchi on this one. Did he have 12 disciples? Did Mithras have 12 disciples? Let's take a look. Mythicists will especially love statues because they can interpret it in many different ways which are very favorable towards their position. One of them is this. Look, here is a statue of Mithras, and there are 12 figures surrounding the statue. This surely means that Mithras had 12 disciples, or at least the number 12 must have come from his cult. I mean, there are many Christians in the room. Who here can explain why Jesus had 12 disciples? Tribes of Israel. So think about it this way. A Jewish sect coming out of a Jewish religion, claiming a Jewish Messiah, using Jewish traditions, used a numbering system by a mystery secretive cult who probably wouldn't have told them anyway. Or we could say that it came from Jewish tradition, 12 tribes of Israel, Jesus corresponding his following towards that for prophetic meaning. But here's the thing. Was Mithras born of a virgin? Yes. Mithras was actually born of a virgin. You know, and you might think, oh my gosh, maybe that's true for, if it's true for that, then does that mean that like a virgin birth thing, does it make me doubt that Jesus actually existed? The problem is we need to take a look at this virgin. This is a rock. The legends and the data that we have of Mithras show that he was born of a rock. Technically a virgin? I mean, these days you can identify as anything. Anyway, so the problem is that Christ mythicism really started coming around in the kind of back alleys of the Enlightenment. So you think about the Enlightenment started in around 16th, 17th century or something like that. And it was the time of the growth of reason and kind of the moving out of religion for society, or at least it started to go that way. And the problem is that you had many people who thought they were historians, but weren't. It's sad to say, like, even the 12 disciples with Mithras and all that was produced by a quote-unquote historian from around the 1800s, I believe, who made that claim without a footnote. So we just have to trust that what he says is true. Problem is that there were a lot of people who were so hostile towards Christianity at the time, of the, again, like just the back alleys of the Enlightenment. This stuff was going around, and eventually, if you want to chart Jesus' mythicism, it started there, and then it got onto the internet. Because on the internet, you can shield yourself in your own little bubbles. Your algorithm can give you your own truth, as it were, by shielding yourself, because you're not going to click on videos that disagree with you, right? So we're only going to give you videos that agree with you. So there are plenty of these circles, for Christians as well, but there are plenty of these circles for Jesus mythicists. And so this is something to really watch out for if someone is really deep in this movement. So let's conclude. We're finishing much earlier. We could probably take a few questions at the end than expected, which is good. I'd say when we get to the data for the reliability of the New Testament, we might run over time. So this is kind of like a nice little warm-up. So 10 sources outside of the New Testament, 10 sources that historians can use, even if they're not Christians, from within the New Testament, at minimum. So whatever you may think, Bart Ehrman concludes this brilliantly in his book. The reality is, whatever else you may think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. And so, if you guys want to know more, especially about the historical basis for the Christian faith, not just for his resurrection, these people are utterly brilliant. There are many more, but you can only fit so many on a slide before people really start squinting. But yeah, brilliant. Like Michael Jones, he is a YouTuber who interacts with the scholarship to really start disproving a lot of real, I just want to say nonsense. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever like seen videos of TikToks or whatever, but often if you go on TikTok for long enough, I think you'll find that knowledge in this race is kind of regressing. Because you'll find some people, there was even like one TikTok trend where there was this one person who believed that the Roman Empire didn't exist. And it's like, that's crazy. And so he does a lot of his work refuting that, actually using historians, university accredited scholars, to actually say, no, let's take a look at the data. You have William Lane Craig. He's kind of a jack of all trades for Christian apologetics. His main is philosophy. But he also dabbles in evidence for the resurrection as well, evidence for the historical faith. He did, and this was very key towards one of my friends coming to faith, he did a debate with a man called Christopher Hitchens. I'm not sure how many of you have known Christopher Hitchens. Very hostile man to the faith. Very hostile man to the faith. And any Christian apologist that he would kind of go against would be utterly minced by him just because of the power of his tongue. Until William Lane Craig came along and actually very calmly gave the data, gave very good reasons, and it made Hitchens it made people realize about Hitchens that a lot of his arguments, or a lot of his strength and his popularity came about how he'd said stuff, not necessarily what he was bringing to the table in terms of evidence. Gary Habermas is probably the leader in the world, although you have Mike Licona as well, of evidence for the resurrection. World leader in the sense of he's just released the first book of his magnum opus. It came out on the 24th of January this year, and it's already exceeding 1,000 pages. And that's only volume 1. He's dedicated his life towards documenting, through historical means, the probability of the resurrection. And also you have Justin Brierley. He's really good if you want to get started in apologetics. If this all just seems too overwhelming, and it is overwhelming, especially because we can just prove Jesus' existence, I believe, so easily. But you can be as skeptical as you want, to where you don't even believe that you exist in and of yourself. But tangents aside, Justin Brierley is a great way to get started into apologetics. His book, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian, that was very instrumental towards me remaining in the faith when I had these questions. So again, this is something to really think about, and something for you to really ponder is, what would you say if to someone who says that Jesus doesn't exist? That's something for you guys to take away. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. These are the dates, so not next week, but I believe the week after, if I haven't messed up the dates again. The 17th, we're going to talk about, can we trust the New Testament? We're going to go into manuscripts. We're going to go into further historical investigation. Has the New Testament been corrupted over time? Was it translated from language to language to language to language to language? There are some games that you can play on Google Translate where you go between languages and it comes up with something completely garbled from what you were saying. Can you trust that? So if you guys want to find that out, then 17th, and then from the strength of both of these cases, we're going to go for, did Jesus rise from the dead, and what does that mean for us today? Not even just as like the evidence which we might present to non-believers, but it's, and I can testify to this, there's something different about knowing that your faith can be proven through historical data. It grounds your faith in such a way which is hard to explain. So this isn't just a dry academic exercise. It's not just if someone says this to you, this is what you say. It's something which actually has devotional potency, devotional power. So this concludes the talk, again, much earlier. But yeah, thank you all for coming. It's really encouraging.